ANDIZI, meaning I will not come down. A stubborn focus on building a great life. Written and read by Beauty Kotela. Chapter 4.1, Your Sanballat, Part 1. We start in Nehemiah 2, verse 18. So they said, let us rise up and build. Then they set their hands to this good work. The next verse after this says, but when Sanballat heard, and the rest is history. You have finally mustered enough courage to rebuild your life, and armed with the grace of God, you even went further to inspect the walls of your life, and now you are ready to rise and build. You are all set to start with the good work. The next thing, up comes your own version of Sanballat and his friends. So the question now comes, who is your Sanballat? On your holy discomfort, on your path to your great life, on your path to fulfilling God's purpose for your life, who is your Sanballat? But dare I say, what is your Sanballat? Because sometimes that Sanballat is not who, but what. And that what is actually more impactful than the who. It's nice for us to look at those people out there as our Sanballat, and we can point a finger at them. But my goodness, Sanballat can also arise from within you. That one has more power to destroy than those who you can point out there. So who and what is your Sanballat? This is in addition to the self-inspection which you did prior to your rebuilding. This question we will attempt to answer for all of us corporately, but individually, each of us have our own answers. Either way, the minute Nehemiah was allowed to go and build, these guys started hating. Have you ever found people who start to hate you and yet they don't even know you and you don't know them? Somewhere you stumble across haters that don't even know and you don't know them, but the anointing in your life, the favor of God on you, conjures up a spirit inside of them and they simply cannot stand you. All of us have external Sanballats. Yes, there is a mission on your life. There is favor to fulfill that mission, but there is also going to be Sanballat. So what to do with these guys? How do you handle them? Can you afford to allow them to derail you from the project of rebuilding your life? Now watch the strategy of Nehemiah as stated in Nehemiah 2 verse 19. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you are doing? Will you rebel against the king? The first strategy of the enemy was to question their legitimacy and thus their identity and purpose. This is the main tool of the devil, sadly utilizing human agents, ourselves and others, to get us to a point where we question our legitimacy, our identity, and eventually our purpose. If he succeeds, he manages to suck the wind out of our sails and sends us on an endless journey of quote unquote self discovery. And yet, God has spoken so loudly in his word. For example, Ephesians 2, verse 10, when he says, for we are God's masterpiece, created in the Messiah Jesus to perform good actions that God prepared long ago to be our way of life. Also, 1 Peter 2, verse 9, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. The texts I have just read clearly illustrate who we are: God's masterpiece, chosen, royal, holy, special. They also show whose we are. We belong to God, his special possession, created in the image of God. Finally, they succinctly tell us our purpose: to perform good actions prepared for us by God. In other words, to declare the praises of him who created us. This is something we ought not to forget, especially as we roll up our sleeves to rebuild. Now, the devil knows this of us too well, and he would have us forget. So if we give him an ear, he will fill our minds with the opposite, thus delegitimizing us, giving us a false identity and purpose. He tried to do the same to Nehemiah and his team at the very onset of the building project. He tried to get them to question the legitimacy of their work, that doing so would be an act of rebellion. There are people who look at you and your actions and see them as rebellious and start to think the goal he or she has, to think that he or she can do this. They would want to give you labels that would make you seem odd and an outsider as you try to pursue your God-given purpose, thus appealing to your need for belonging. Many people would be much farther in life, but they do not want to leave the crowd and thus be seen as misfits. So they remain with the chickens, pecking on the floor, while deep within them there is a strong desire to soar with the eagles. But they have taken the false identity and purpose of chickens. That is a recipe for misery. I am so fascinated by Nehemiah's response to this first offense, as shown in Nehemiah 2, verse 20. The God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build. I honestly think that more than addressing Sanballat, Nehemiah was talking to himself and his men, reminding them who and whose they are. We belong to the God of heaven, and as his servants, we will arise and build. It's as if he was saying to the detractors, you may have a problem with what we are doing. That is your problem, not ours. And then they remind each other and us that not only has God commissioned us to rebuild, but he will prosper us. Ellen White, in the book Christ Object Lessons, puts it this way: when we give ourselves wholly to God and in our work follow his directions, he makes himself responsible for its accomplishment. She continues, he would not have us conjecture as to the success of our honest endeavors. Not once should we even think of failure. And so they had to remind themselves that their God knows no failure. When you embark on a project as great as building or rebuilding the kind of life that God has in mind for you, affirmations are crucial. They are the plans he declares in Jeremiah 29, verse 11. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. This reminder will help you to stand against those things or those people who wish to distract you. But most importantly, they will help you to get through the challenging times. After that response and affirmation, Nehemiah and his team kept their mouths shut and started the project of rebuilding the fallen walls of Jerusalem. Sanballat and his company were also not going to let up. In fact, they were now furious, enraged by the courage of these Jews. Sanballat aimed to stop the Jews even before they could start. And it happens so often to so many of us that you finally manage to receive the conviction to rebuild, whether you are rebuilding your life, your marriage, your business, your community, etc., that the devil, either through your internal voice or external influences, comes in to question what you are doing, who you are, and your legitimacy. Often he will instill fear, remind you of your past mistakes when you tried to do this before and failed, and get you to question God's blessing over your rebuilding project. And depending on which one you choose to feed, fear or faith, you will either start to rebuild or you will retreat in shame, asking yourself, what was I thinking? My recommendation: close your ears to the negative voices, external or internal, and increase the volume on who God says you are and his purpose for your life, and start rebuilding. Seeing that they had failed to get the Jews to question their identity and legitimacy, the next step for Sanballat was to undermine their abilities. In other words, although they may have been confident of who they were and God's commission on the project, they still needed to feel confident in their abilities to carry out the task at hand. And so Sanballat planned to kill their confidence. That was Sanballat's next move. Listen to what he now said in front of his brothers and the army of Samaria in Nehemiah 4, verse 1 to 2. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, whatever they build, if even a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. This text is crystallizing the mechanism that leads to the loss of confidence for so many of us. I am fascinated by the phrase, he spoke before his brethren. While there are times where the enemy will undermine you in your face, in most cases, this undermining takes place in a conversation about you and not to you. This is, of course, a conversation that you get to hear about. I'm mentioning this to remind you that they are not talking to you, they are talking about you, which means that you are not part of that conversation. Do not join in. In other words, what people say about you in their conversation is their opinion of you. They may be right or they may be wrong, But for it to affect you, you will need to own it, put it in your spirit, internalize it, believe it, and then walk in it. My recommendation, their opinion, their problem, not yours. So resist the temptation that many of us sometimes find ourselves giving into, confronting the detractors. How dare you say this about me? That's an absolute waste of time and energy. You have a big project requiring your full attention. Don't get distracted by naysayers. Having said so, I do not wish to undermine the depth and the strength of the actions of Tobiah. They keep insulting God's children, calling them feeble Jews. They question not only their abilities, but the weakness of the materials they are using. They go further to pronounce even on the outcomes of this project. In other words, what on earth are you feeble Jews doing? Do you even know what you are doing? Look at the substandard and poor materials you are using. You will never finish these walls. Even if you do, the walls will be so weak that even a fox will break them down. Save yourself the humiliation and stop while you can. Doesn't this just sound so familiar? Many a times, when you finally garner up enough courage to start rebuilding or pursuing a great project, the enemy comes to ask you these debilitating questions. Don't listen to him. The devil is a liar. And in this regard, when the devil comes and questions your abilities, I commend to the response of Nehemiah, which reminds me of the response of Christ as stated in the Bible, Matthew 27, verse 14. He answered him not a word. Watch Nehemiah's response to this second jab in Nehemiah 4, verse 4 to 5. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads and give them as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity, and do not let their sin be blotted out from before you, for they have provoked you to anger before the builders. Not a word to the enemy, but straight to the Father. Hear, O God, and deal with them. In other words, be still and know that I am God. End of part 1.